Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe.
Thank you so much for joining us on Your Legislators this week. I'm Fred Martino. Joining us from Santa Fe, Representative Bill McCamley. Bill, thank you so much for being here on Your Legislators.
Good morning, Fred. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's great to have you here. I want to start with budget issues. As you know, the big thing that we've been talking about all week long, the Senate and House came to a compromise to close the deficit for the current fiscal year. We'll get to what you may not like about that compromise, but let's start with anything that you see positive in the deal.
Well, I think the problem that we've got to face, and this is something that I think your viewers need to understand, is that the state made a decision back in 2003 and 2004 to cut taxes for wealthy people. So in 2003, there was a huge income tax cut for those in the upper tax brackets. And in 2004, taxes on capital gains were cut. So if you make income from investments right now in New Mexico, you're only paying half what someone who actually works for a living is paying. And in 2013, we actually cut corporate taxes. Now, the whole point of this, obviously, is depending on the side of the aisle you're on, it's either trickle down or supply side economics, and it was supposed to spur job creation. The problem is it completely didn't work. There's been no documented effect to create jobs from those tax cuts. Now, when those tax cuts were made, oil and gas prices were very high. And remember, oil and gas contributes about 35% in both direct and indirect taxes to the state budget. So when oil prices, for instance, are at $85 a barrel, $100 a barrel, and you're paying $3 or $3.50 at the pump, that's hard on you, but it's good for the state. And we get a lot of money coming in to pay for things like schools and Medicaid and museums and cops and all those sorts of things. When those tax cuts were made, oil and gas prices were high. The problem is now oil and gas prices have dropped, and they have been really sticking at about $50 to $54 per barrel. And since we made those tax cuts and jobs haven't been created, therefore creating a higher tax base, it means we have a lot less money to now pay for things like schools and Medicaid and state cops. And so that's really the situation that we find ourselves in today, where there's this hole in the budget. We just haven't had the money coming in to pay for basic government services that we all rely on to live in a society that works.
Okay, and in terms of the compromise, tell me what you like about it, what you don't like about it. As you know, a lot of controversy for this current fiscal year because it involves taking some of the reserve money from school districts across the state, including right here in southern New Mexico.
Well, the problem we've had in the legislature is with the governor. So the governor has refused to even consider any kind of revenue increase. What does that mean? It means she has refused to consider legalizing cannabis for social use, which would bring in $60 million or so a year and help fund the schools and economic development efforts that would help us create these jobs. She's refused to look at things like asking people who make money off capital gains to pay the same tax rate that everybody else pays. And she's even refused to stop the decreases in corporate taxes. So that corporate tax cut we passed in 2013 is actually going in phases. And there's been a request that we stop that, freeze those phases, and that wouldn't even increase taxes. It would just keep the corporate tax rate level for a couple years while we bring the money in that would allow for us to fix this budget deficit. She has refused to do any of those things.
Okay, so you've hit on a big issue here, Bill. The governor has indicated she will not accept new taxes, but she may be open to closing loopholes in our current tax system. The big question is, though, Are there enough politically viable loopholes to close to take care of the budget for next year? Because that still has to be done.
It does, and the governor actually proposed to take $120 million from the public schools. That was her solution,
right,
in closing this loophole or this budget hole that we have.
I understand that
real problem
for the current fiscal year. But as we look now to your work that you're going to be doing through the session on the budget for the next fiscal year, are there enough loopholes that are politically viable that can be closed to deal with this what really is, a lot of people are calling, a fiscal crisis? Or is that just not possible?
Well, I don't know. We're going to have to find out. And I'll tell you this, though, Fred. I've come up here in February of last year, January and February last year, and then for those of your viewers that keep up with state government, you know we had a special session in October to deal with this situation. And unfortunately, the governor vetoed some of the things that we were asking for in terms of closing this loophole. And the result is we're doing this again. And I will not vote for another budget that does not have some kind of revenue increases in it and that asks people to pay a little bit more for the services that government provides. We have cut the budget, and it's been done on the backs of school teachers and social workers and cops and all these other government employees. And that's enough.
Okay,
so the governor needs to come to the table. You know, the negotiation requires dance partners. And if you're not willing to get on the floor, then you have a problem.
Okay, so let's get to some of the specific proposals. Senator John Arthur Smith, as you know, has proposed a 10-cent a gallon increase in the state's gasoline tax. We have one of the lowest gas taxes in the country, and it hasn't been increased for many, many years to simply keep up with the inflationary cost of taking care of roads and other infrastructure. Let's talk about that to begin with.
Well, from what I understand, the proposals that are out there for the gas tax are, as you described, but there's also been an effort to make that gas tax dependent on oil and gas prices, which ends up making sense, right? So remember, if oil prices are high, the state brings in a lot of direct money. For every dollar per barrel that oil prices go up or down, the state either gains or loses $8 million. So from what I understand, the proposals that are being floated are to increase the gas tax, but only when prices are low. And when it hits $2.50 or $3 a gallon, the gas tax then goes away because the state's bringing in revenue directly from the oil and gas industry as a whole.
But
so
that gets
from
to
what
a very,
I understand, those are the prices.
That gets to a very important principle that goes beyond the gas tax bill, and I want to just give a minute to talk about it because it deals with a lot of different taxes and a lot of different expenses. One of the things that critics, as you know, say that deals with tax policy is that you have to look at math. You have to look at the fact that, in fact, even in the best of times, as we've had over the last decade or so, you have inflation that averages about 2% a year. So the notion that inflation doesn't exist and we don't need to adjust revenue and expense just defies math.
Well, and it's true for a lot of things. For instance, just the other day, the House of Representatives voted to move a minimum wage increase through committee. And the problem we've had is that the minimum wage in New Mexico has not gone up since 2009. So as you correctly pointed out, the cost of food, the cost of fixing your car, the cost of healthcare, all of these basic needs have increased in price for the average New Mexican. But since so many New Mexicans work for the minimum wage, and that price has been stuck at $7.50 an hour, while other states around us, like Arizona and Colorado, have increased that minimum wage, that's not fair. And so it's really important when we look at inflation and cost of living that we're making sure that if you work 40 hours a week in this state and we do everything we ask you to do in terms of working hard, taking care of your kids, obeying the law, all those things, and you're still living in poverty, that's not right.
Well, and of course, that also deals with revenue because our state has an income tax. So if people are making more money, they are often paying more state income tax as well. You know, that's one principle. So we've dealt with math here, and this is a big problem for the state of New Mexico, essentially sometimes in legislation ignoring the math that affects inflation. Another issue that a lot of folks talk about in public policy, as you know, are the notion of user fees. Essentially, if something costs money, the person using it should be paying for it. So this deals with alcohol and tobacco taxes. Polls show these are very popular with the public. And it's because, of course, in part due to the fact that these have enormous health costs and law enforcement costs, other things for our government. So is there any movement on your part to deal with this, kind of equalizing the cost of alcohol and tobacco with the taxes that are paid on those products?
I'm not really familiar with any of the proposals that have been put out. I will say that a week from Saturday, we'll be considering in the first committee the Cannabis Revenue and Freedom Act, which would legalize cannabis for social use here in New Mexico. As many of your viewers probably know, that has been done in Colorado, it's been done in Washington, and now with Arizona, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine following suit, 20% of the people in the United States can now use cannabis for social use. Now, in terms of taxes, what does that mean? We here in New Mexico are proposing a 15% state direct tax for people that buy cannabis for social use. And revenue estimates show that that will raise between $60 and $70 million in direct money for the state. And we've earmarked that money so that most of it goes to education, behavioral health, and economic development. Now, that's not the only thing that will benefit the state. As we take this money out of the hands of drug cartels, because remember, people are going to use cannabis whether it's legal or not, and right now, all that revenue is going down to Mexico where they use it to murder people. What we see is we bring that into the legal realm, we raise direct taxes for the state, and you're going to see increases in the amount of income taxes being brought into the state, as well as gross receipts taxes and property taxes, because everybody's doing better, and that money's now in the real economy. So for me, that's really the best proposal we've got going forward, because it's direct, it's working in other places, and we can do it now.
And of course, I know that you have a bill that would do that through the legislature. There's another bill that would do it through a constitutional amendment. Voters would have to then approve that, I believe, in 2018. Is there enough support for that constitutional amendment bill, knowing that if that one doesn't pass, it's unlikely that we'll have legalized cannabis because of the threat of a veto by the governor?
Well, even if the governor vetoes something and we have to go with a constitutional amendment, that won't be on until the next ballot comes out in 2018. So
yes,
if the governor continues her very, very, in my opinion, non-logical stance on this, then we're going to have to see about moving forward with a constitutional amendment. But in terms of support from the people, yes, it's absolutely going to pass if given a chance. The last two polls that have been done on this in the state show that an excess of 60% of New Mexicans support legalizing cannabis for social use. And in fact, in one poll, when you told people the money would likely be going to education, then that actually rises to about 68%. So I really have no doubt that if it goes to the people, it will pass.
Well, but
it's
that was
just
the question.
Where are we at in the legislature?
Is there support in the legislature for a constitutional amendment so that it indeed can go to the people?
We're going to see. So it made it to the floor of the Senate last year. It only failed by 5 votes. There's been a 2-vote swing. So it's going to be 1 or 2 votes apart. And as we've seen in the past, people have really started changing their minds on this as we get away from this old reefer madness mentality that's completely wrong, and people learn the actual facts about the topic.
As you know, there's another proposal that would allow farmers to grow hemp, which is something that agriculture experts say is very important because it could raise a lot of money for farmers, and also it's a low water use crop.
Yeah, this is a no-brainer. So we import something like between $400 and $600 million worth of hemp every year from Canada. Because in the United States, it's illegal to use the substance to create bath oil and cushion seat fillers and parts for subwoofers and all the things that hemp is used for, but it's illegal to grow it here. And that's really dumb. Now remember, even if you don't support cannabis, hemp does not have THC in it. You grow it out in the fields. If you try to smoke it, you're just going to get a headache. And so we really need to make this happen. Those bills have started moving through the House and the Senate already. They passed 2 years ago with overwhelming bipartisan support. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed it. And so we're hoping this year she maybe comes to her senses a little bit and sees the benefits that this will have for our farmers specifically, but for the economy as a whole. And if she vetoes it again, if there's a chance of override with the votes that were taken a couple years ago, we might be able to get that.
You mentioned the minimum wage earlier, and as you know, there are a number of proposals out there everywhere from a local bill from Senator Bill Soules that would be about $8.50 an hour. I believe it's $8.45, all the way up to $15 an hour. Do you think, again, just like with marijuana, that the only way that this is going to work is if it's a bill that includes a constitutional amendment because of the threat of a veto?
Well, this once again is on the governor. It is unconscionable to me that we have a policy in this state that says if you're working 40 hours a week, you're going to live in poverty. That's just not an American value. And the problem we see from everyone is that they're on this treadmill. And usually you're supposed to be able to get ahead if you do everything we ask of you. But the very best you're doing is running in place on this treadmill. And for a lot of folks, if you have a medical emergency or something else happens, you get kicked right off the treadmill, even though you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. So the minimum wage is a tool that will help us get people back on the treadmill and hopefully start getting ahead. And for me, the real important part of any minimum wage bill that we put in is the cost of living adjustment that happens every year. So we've seen that in Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe, where they have raised the minimum wage. You've really seen no negative economic impact, but you've seen people that are working 40 hours a week start having the opportunity to live a decent life, to afford the basic things that they need to work and live, and maybe go see a movie once a month. And when you have that cost of living increase on the end of it, it gives people the opportunity to do that even when cost of living starts increasing with all the goods that you talked about earlier.
As you know, Bill, the argument in the past has dealt with the fact that there would be competitive disadvantages for New Mexico, but now we have Colorado increasing their minimum wage. Arizona, I believe it's $12. It will eventually be $12 an hour in Arizona. So with that development, do you think that more legislators will come around on this, essentially looking at, again, the math, the fact that if you look at the minimum wage, if it had kept up with inflation from 1968, it would be a little over $10 an hour.
And there's a really interesting study that was done a few years ago, Fred, from Washington and Idaho. And what happened was Washington as a state raised their minimum wage. Remember, Idaho is a bordering state. And Idaho has not raised the minimum wage. I still believe they're at the federal minimum of $7.25 an hour. And what common perception was going to be is all the jobs that were located in those regional towns would go across the border to Idaho. What actually ended up happening is all the workers from the border area and from Idaho went over to Washington to get jobs. So the businesses on the Washington side of the border actually did a lot better. Furthermore, those cities actually saw, and you see this with the minimum wage across the country, when you give a tax break to a person who's insanely rich, a lot of times they'll invest that money in China or Brazil or at least in New York in the stock market. When you give a raise to someone who's making that minimum, what do? They spend more of it on buying a new car, or fixing their current car, on buying school clothes for their children, on going out to a movie once in a while. That money stays in the local economy and really ends up benefiting the local communities in which they live. And so this is something that works. It creates wealth for those people that need the help, are most vulnerable, and it helps the local businesses that need the help as well.
I want to go from minimum wage jobs to jobs that pay six figures. And this is an important question for you. As you're aware, the former New Mexico Environment Department leader, Ryan Flynn, left and quickly became director of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. As you know, critics say that this is not just in New Mexico, but all across the country, and including at the federal level. There ought to be some kind of a period of time, 2 years or more is often recommended, between when you can work for government and then move into a job where you're lobbying, working for the interest of business to influence government. What do you think about this issue, Bill?
That absolutely has to happen, because here's the problem. At the very least, there's a perception that if you move from government into lobbying right away, there could have been some interactions that have happened when you were in government, that you could have made decisions to benefit a certain company and then gotten rewarded with a very high-paying job for those decisions. Now, that may happen or it may not happen, but even if there's a perception of that, what we have in this country, in this state, is a real gap in trust between many of the people and government officials like me. And we, in government, have a real responsibility to try and find ways of getting money out of politics, of creating an ethics commission to hold ourselves accountable, and creating laws like the one you're talking about that gives that cooling off period, so at the very least there's not a misperception or an erosion even more of that trust between the people and the government. That we're making decisions. Hold on, let me just finish this, Fred. Basic government class in high school and college, you learn about this thing called the social contract. And the deal is supposed to be this: you vote for me or whoever, and you mark that thing down with your Scantron in the voting booth. And in return for that vote, I'm supposed to make decisions in your best interest in terms of tax policy and laws that we create, not my best interest. And that is really, really important, that we in public office understand what that promise means, what that deal is, and that we work to try to get policies that hold ourselves accountable and make sure that people can keep that trust.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. I want to ask you about something else that's very interesting. A couple of bills that would open up the primary system in New Mexico. One is rather conventional. It allows folks to, if they're not registered with a party, choose if they want to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. There's another one, though, that's a constitutional amendment again, so folks would get a chance to decide on this directly, which would really be interesting. In California, they're doing this, in some other states. It allows one primary for all candidates, and then the top two finishers square off in the general election. What do you think of these ideas?
Well, I fully support the ability for independents to vote, as we see more and more people are choosing to register independent. And some people in the parties are saying, well, if you want to vote in the primaries, you need to register as one of the parties. The problem I have with that is people are not doing that. And so our current system really leaves those folks out of the primary process. And I absolutely support any measure that would come up that would allow for everyone to participate in the political process at all levels. The more we have people that are engaged in democracy, the better off we're going to be, both as a government and, to be honest with you, as an individual candidate.
Do you prefer one of these bills over another, or you're not sure yet?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look. I like what California's doing. I think there are a lot of states for a long time that have had these kind of open primaries, like Michigan, where you can go in and vote. As an independent, you can choose one way or the other. I don't know. We'll have to see. My committees, I mostly focus on job creation. That's kind of my issue, tax policy and economic development. And Fred, that's one more thing. We haven't really talked about creating new jobs for the state. And as you talk about that fiscal crisis, that budget hole that we find ourselves in, if we're not focused on doing things like expanding broadband, finding a finance system that works, creating additional incentives to do well in terms of career technical education. These are the things that are going to allow us to crawl out of this hole that we're in economically. If we don't focus on those, if we don't remember that long-term job creation has to be one of our priorities, we're going to keep treading water and just trying to keep the lights on, not realizing that we're standing in quicksand. So that has to be a priority. And for me, that is my absolute top priority for this session and moving forward in my career in public office.
Okay, and of course you did talk about your proposal for legalizing cannabis, which would certainly, many people say, would definitely be a job creator in Colorado. Even a tourism industry has grown surrounding their legalization of marijuana. I want to ask you, as we wrap up here, about something that is related to jobs and attracting people to work in New Mexico, but this is in the public service. The governor wanted to cut compensation for teachers and state employees. Democrats have spoken out strongly against this idea. Is it dead?
It is for me. I won't vote for it. Look, our teachers have the most important job in our society. They take care of our kids for 7, 8, 9 hours every day. They should be paid at a rate that shows their importance to us. And what we're seeing is that with this massive increase in testing, with the governor's continual assaults on public education, that people are either choosing not to go into the teaching profession, or after being in for a couple of years, they're deciding they don't want to do it anymore. And that's just wrong. Public education is a bedrock system for who we are as a community. The fact that every student has the ability to go to a public school, learn basic skills they need to function, that's vital. And the other problem I have is that some folks actually want to use these strategies of eroding public teacher pay, of doing massive testing, to privatize our schools. They don't like the public education system they have, and they want to turn this over to corporations. And I am completely and utterly opposed to that. I'm a huge supporter of our public schools. I'm a product of the public schools in Las Cruces. I went to Mayfield. I got a great education. And we have to defend that system that we have now. And that means we have to work on paying not only our teachers, but educational assistants, the janitors, the cooks, everyone who takes care of our students. They have to be paid at a reasonable rate.
Okay, Representative Bill McCamley joining us from Santa Fe this week. Bill, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Fred.
All right, and thank you at home for joining us on Your Legislators. I'm Fred Martino. We'll look for you again next week.